Hello everyone, welcome to today's session. Good evening, I hope I am audible. Yeah, okay. So after a long gap, we are continuing with the UPSC CSE NCERT series, and we are into the lecture 7 of NCERT History Modern India textbook. Okay, so this is lecture 7. We have already completed first 11 chapters in the previous classes. So today we are moving on to 12th and 13th chapter. Okay. Okay. Seema, thank you. Good evening. So without any further ado, let's begin this chapter. Chapter 12, Growth of New India, the Nationalist Movement from 1858 to 1905. Okay, so before moving on to this chapter, let me just give you a recap. In the previous sessions, we looked into how the national movement, how the India's independence fight, or maybe we can say how the early stages of India's independence fight. For example, the revolt of 1857 and the early reformers and their activities on educating Indians. Similarly, certain important government acts brought in by the British, etc., etc. We saw all that in previous sessions. In this session, we are going to see from 1858, that is from the aftermath of the revolt of 1857, what all changes happened in the Indian independence struggle and the clear beginning of Indian national movement. Okay, the Indian national movement starts itself in the correct or in the perfect form since 1885 from the formation of Indian National Congress. Okay, so we are looking into all those era. Also, we will be covering the moderate phase of Indian freedom struggle, and from the extremist phase onwards, in the next chapter, tomorrow's session, we will look at it. Okay, so in the second half of 19th century, that is after the revolt of 1857, a lot of changes happened. We already saw what are those changes. What are the changes that happened from the British point of view? Okay, what all did they change in India? Their activities, their methods, their outlook towards Indian orthodoxy. How much did they stop interfering with India's customs and practices and all? All these things we looked into in the previous class. Okay, but in the Indians' perspective, what all did change? Okay, after the 1857 revolt, a lot changed, especially the national political consciousness. Okay, people of India began to actually understand the concept of nationalism. Until then, there was no India. Okay, there was lots of principalities, lots of princely states fighting each other for their own local needs. Even in the revolt of 1857, we saw that it was not a common goal, or it was never for the independence of India that the revolt of 1857 was fought, but rather it was again for personal vested interests. Okay, or say in the interests of certain local groups or interested stakeholders. But afterwards, we see that a kind of nationalism started to grow in India, and the most important factor that contributed to this was none other than British itself. Okay, so British directly or indirectly, or maybe by intentional, and it may not have been intentional, but still British was one of the biggest factors that unified India. Okay, and later in December 1885, International Congress is formed, which gives the national movement a very national and very unified character. Okay, so this is a very brief introduction. So let's see what are the consequences of the foreign domination or the consequences of the British rule in India, or how did it affect the rise and cultivation of national movement in India. Okay, so if you have any queries in between, you can put it in the YouTube live chat session, and I will be looking at it at the end of each slide, and I will try to answer that. Okay. All right. So consequence of foreign domination. So actually it was the British rule, as I have already mentioned. It was the British rule that directly or indirectly which facilitated this national consciousness in India. Okay, it actually provided material, moral and intellectual conditions for the development of national movement. Okay, British was the common enemy for everybody. So this common enemy actually made its enemies, that is the Indians, okay, of all classes, sections, etc., etc., unified against it. Until now, Indians were fighting with each other, internal quarrels for their own benefits. But when a foreign enemy, a common enemy occurred, Indians started to become united. Okay, and national political consciousness started to arise. And they began to recognize the evils of foreign rule. Okay, after 1857 revolt, it was very clear that British had no intention of, achieving, a success for the Indians. Britishers were in India for their own personal goals, their own commercial wealth, and nothing else. After the 1857 revolt, it was very clear. Okay, based on the way in which this revolt was struck down, it was very apparent for the Indians that Britishers are up to no good in India. Okay, so the foundations of the international movement lay in the fact that increasingly British rule became the major cause of India's economic backwardness. So British rule affected India in various fields, okay, politically, socially, economically, educationally, culturally. But the most evident and the most painstaking area where it was very visible was in economy. Indian economy was completely ruined by the foreign rule of British. Okay, we have already studied the drain of wealth theory put forth by Rabbi Nauroji. According to that theory, it was very apparent that Britishers are making India a market for their finished products and a source of raw materials. So India was nothing but a market or a source of raw material, and there was no industrialization happening in India. While industrialization happened in Britain and in other European countries, India was actually deindustrialized. Its traditional economy collapsed, handicrafts collapsed. Okay, the loss of patronage from princely states made things further worse for crafts people. Okay, so all these things affected India economically, and when when the economy of a country is affected, it will have its repercussions in all other sectors. Every class of people, rich or poor or whatever, everybody will get affected when the economy of a country is affected. Okay, that is very obvious. So this is the area where British rule affected the Indians the worst, and this is the area in which Indians understood that the British is actually up to no good. Every class, every section of the Indian society gradually understood that their interests were suffering at the hands of foreign rulers. Okay, and this is the beginning or the birth of national consciousness against this common enemy. Alright, so the major classes of Indians, okay, the majority of Indians at that time were peasants, artisans, or the workers, okay, the laborers. These were the numerical majorities of India. Of course, there were intelligentsia, other business people, etc., etc., but they were comparatively the minorities. The three prominent classes numerically were peasants, artisans, and workers. Okay, and all these sections had discovered that their own political rights, okay, their own freedom, everything, their own means of living, etc., are actually threatened by this foreign rule. Not just economically, but politically, culturally, even at an intellectual level. Okay, even education did not percolate down. Okay, earlier when we studied Wood's dispatch, we looked into the downward filtration theory. Wood's dispatch actually repudiated downward filtration theory. What was this theory? According to this theory, which was put forth by the English, especially people like Macaulay and all, a handful of the top, the creamy layer, the Indian intelligentsia, or a handful of Indian upper classes will be given education, and from them this education will percolate downwards. This is the downward filtration theory. This was the idea. There was no effort taken by the British as such for mass education. Okay, so obviously education did not percolate downwards. Many of them belonged to the lower castes and had still to bear social and economic oppression by upper castes. These people, these peasants, artisans, workers, all these people, majority of them still belong to the lower castes. Okay, at that time, caste system was also very much prevalent in India. Even now it is still there, but at those times it was even more rigid. Okay, and even in that level, these people were considered as lower castes. So they were undergoing all kinds of oppression, not just from the British, but also from upper class Indians and zamindars, princely states, etc., etc. Okay, so this was the condition of common man at that time. The rise of Indian intelligentsia, the educated Indians, they actually started to use this education that was given to the upper class Indians to, contribute to the Indian national political awakening. Okay, people like Raja Ram Mohan Roy, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar. We studied about all these people in the last class. These people actually started to use their learning, use their education to, bring forth certain concepts and certain reforms in the Indian society against the orthodox, against the rigidities, etc. of the caste system and of the religions. Okay, those who had earlier, as in 1857, supported the British rule in the hope that though alien, it would modernize and industrialize the country, were gradually disappointed. During the time of 1857 revolt, we studied that Indian intelligentsia did not take part in the 1857 revolt. Okay, actually they thought that these Westerners could actually be helpful for Indians. They would actually help to transform Indian society. Because until 1857, that was the case. Okay, people like, Governor Generals like William Bentinck, for example, supported these reformers in, abolition of sati, or say, promoting widow remarriage and all these things. So the Indian intelligentsia thought that Britishers could actually help in transforming India. Okay, and they believed in the British. That is why they, to an extent, they stood out of the 1857 revolt. But after the 1857 revolt, through the Queen's Proclamation of 1858, Britishers changed their attitude. They stopped interfering with Indian customs and all, and they even started to side with the religious orthodoxies. So now these reformers understood that Britishers are up to no good. They are not actually going to reform India or anything. They wanted to make sure that their commercial and administrative interests in India are safeguarded. That's all. And they would do anything for the said purpose. Okay, so the Indian intelligentsia were not happy with the British rule, so they were disappointed. Economic exploitation of the British started to, increase India's poverty. Britain was reducing India into a state of economic colony. Okay, I already explained this. A source of raw materials and a market for the finished goods. So India was nothing but an economic colony for Britishers. Instead of increasing personal, freedoms like, freedom of speech, freedom of press, etc., etc., they began to put more and more restrictions into these fields. Okay, for example, the Vernacular Press Act, the Newspapers Act, etc., etc. So rather than, making Indians more, achieve their personal freedom of, freedom of speech, press, etc., etc., Britishers started to control them. Okay, impose more and more regulations and restrictions into Indians. So this was against everything the Indian intelligentsia was hoping for. Okay, now everybody has understood that Britishers want to safeguard their self-interests. Okay, now the common enemy is common for everybody. Okay, until 1857, Britishers were enemies for certain sections of the people, and they were actually friends with the other sections. But post 1857, a huge majority of Indians became commonly opposed against British. The only sections who still remained with the British were the Zamindars, princely kings, etc., etc. Okay, even in the 1857 revolt, they sided with the British because it is the British who gave them that power. Okay, so these big Zamindars and princes, they all stood with the British till 1947. Okay, till the independence happened to a huge extent. Okay, but anyway, after this revolt, huge sections of Indian society came against the British rule. Okay, now let's look at another particular section of India, that is the rising Indian capitalist class. Okay, after industrialization happened in Britain, in India also certain small industries started to come up, and the industrial class, initially they were very pro-capitalist and siding with Britain and all, but they understood that the Britishers have no interest in promoting Indian industries. Okay, so if Indian industrial class has to acquire more profit and maximize their scale of production and all, then they have to rely upon a government that is formed for India by the Indians. Okay, a British government, a foreign government will never help them in achieving success in industrial areas. Okay, the Indian industrial classes also started understanding this. So they also eventually turned against the British and sided with the nationalists. Indian capitalists too therefore realized that only a national government would create conditions for the rapid development of Indian traders and industries. Okay, as I have mentioned earlier, zamindars, landlords and princes, they stuck with British till the end. These classes were given these powers by the British. Okay, through zamindari or the permanent settlement system, Britishers gave the title, the power to collect, all the rents and all from the tenants to zamindars. Similarly, all the rights of the tenants were abolished and the entire property was given to zamindar. So the zamindar is actually made by the British in a sense, in a way. Okay. Similarly, princes, they were given subsidiary alliances and they were given help against other powers. It is the Britishers who are actually protecting them. Okay. So similarly, landlords. So all these three classes stood with the British till the end of Indian independence struggle, that is in 1947. Anyway, the foreign character of British regime in itself produced a nationalistic reaction. I mean, obviously, and nobody will want a foreign power to rule us. Even just think about yourself. If we are currently ruled by a foreign power, would we accept it? I mean, even if that ruler is pretty good, okay, and even if that ruler is doing good, still we won't like it. Why? Because we are supposed to be ruled by ourselves. India should be ruled by Indians, not some other foreign country, irrespective of the character of the rule. Okay, this is the nationalism, the kind of political consciousness that is happening around this time. Okay, so this movement was a national movement because it unified people from different classes and sections of the society who sang their mutual differences to unite against the common enemy. So until now, we do not have a national movement. We have movements, small rebellions, revolts, mutinies, etc., here and there, but never we had a movement in the national scale that can be called a national movement. But after all these initial struggles, finally, after the birth of International Congress, we will see that we have something more of an organized, structured, national character. And we can effectively say that a national kind of movement, a national movement has started finally in India. Most importantly, because of the British rule. Okay, there is no other factor that contributes to this national movement than British itself. Plenty of factors are there which do contribute to it. For example, education, okay, or the weakening of Indian economy, weakening of the Indian freedom of people, etc. All these are there, but still the British factor is the most prominent factor that contributed to the rise of national movement, or to the rise of a movement that began to have a national character. Okay, good evening, Vasanthi Lakshmi. Now, administrative and economic unification of the country. So I told you that British is the factor that contributed to this national movement. So how exactly did it happen? How exactly did India unify against this common enemy? India has to unify economically, it has to unify administratively, politically, etc., right? So administrative and economic unification, these are the two main areas of unification that had to happen for India to become India as a nation. Okay, so British had gradually introduced a uniform and modern system of government. Okay, full credits for that goes to Britain, no doubt. I mean, India never had a unified government until British came into the picture. Maybe this government is completely British. There is no representation of Indians at higher levels. Obviously true. But even then, it is actually the British who introduced this uniform system of government throughout the territory of India. That is beyond any doubt. Okay, so administrative unification happened like that. Now, as far as economy is concerned, the destruction of the rural and local self-sufficient economy and introduction of modern trade industries. Okay, sorry, spelling mistake. Modern trade and industries on an all-India scale had increasingly made Indian economic life a single whole. Okay, so earlier we had this concept of village self-sufficiency. Okay, when I talked about village self-sufficiency in the previous classes, I told you in certain senses it is good. This self-sufficiency character is pretty good because it can sustain on its own. But in other levels, it is a very dangerous thing, this self-sufficiency. Why? because it becomes stagnant. It will become completely cut off from the rest of the world. It will never look into what is happening around it. Okay, so these local industries, the rural life itself was completely destroyed by Britain, and in its place certain other industries, maybe for the benefit of Britain itself, came up. But anyway, these kinds of industries, which eventually became a, which eventually gained a national character. Okay, for example, textiles, railways, telegraph. Okay, all these things which were introduced by Britain contributed a lot for the unification of India in various fields, not just economically, but politically, in terms of communication and all these things. Okay, so as a result of the spread of modern Western education and thought during the 19th century, a large number of Indians imbibed on modern, rational, secular, democratic and national political outlook. Okay, so the Indian intelligentsia, using their influences, using their learning and intelligence, they started their own reform organizations. These organizations had its own press. They brought out various pamphlets, newspapers, journals, monthlies, etc., and all these, most of these were actually in vernacular languages, so that even the common man of India could understand these ideas and become politically conscious and awaken himself. Okay, so all these eventually contributed to the rise of political, national consciousness among Indian masses. English language. This is a very interesting fact. English language actually, there was in 1835 there was a controversy between the Orientalists and Anglicists. We already studied that. Whether English should be the medium of communication or should it be something else, the vernacular languages itself. And finally, it was settled in favor of English. So this English language was actually both a boon and a bane. It was a boon in the sense English language became a common language for most of the Indians. Okay, because Britishers are ruling throughout the territory of India and their transactions are done in English, and the the Western thoughts and their writings, poetry, literature, everything is in English. So when these people went abroad and studied, these Indian intelligentsia went abroad and studied and all, they all studied in English medium, in English language. So English became a common language throughout India. In that sense, it was a boon. But in the sense that English was completely, lacking, or English never managed to get into the rural side of India, made English a barrier. Okay, because the top crux, the upper classes, the educated Indians, they could communicate well. Okay, they could understand English, they could communicate their ideas, they could use English as a medium of connecting the entirety of India. But the rural India was completely unaware of English. I mean, they did not know English. Okay, they knew only the vernacular languages. So the language barrier existed as far as majority of Indians were concerned. So in that sense, English was the spread of English was a bad, possibly a bad thing in the field of culture. Okay, so in fact, English soon became a barrier to the spread of modern knowledge among the common people. It also acted as a wall separating the educated urban people from the common people, especially in rural areas. This is what I just said. Okay, consequently, it became about the modern ideas spread faster and deeper in many countries where they were propagated through indigenous languages than in India, where emphasis on English confined them to narrow urban section. Clear? So in other countries, for example, China or maybe Indonesia, in these countries, modern ideas spread in native languages, or maybe in Africa. Okay, their own local languages, vernacular languages. So so how is that good? It is good because majority of the people knows vernacular languages. So when these kinds of hi-fi ideas, okay, high Western political ideas spread through indigenous languages, it becomes easier for common man to understand it, which means it will have a comparatively larger backing. But in India, unfortunately, rather than vernacular language, these kinds of ideas spread through English. So language barrier became an imminent threat. So far as common people were concerned, the spread of modern ideas occurred through the developing Indian languages, the growing literature in them, and most of all the popular Indian language press. Modern education introduced identical courses of study all over the country. Consequently, educated Indians tended to have common views, feelings, aspirations, ideals, etc. This is another thing. When Britishers started to introduce their own educational system in India, what happened? There was a common syllabus. Okay, so everybody in the country is, more or less studying something of the same line. Okay, there was something common. It's not like South India is studying something different compared to Western India, compared to Eastern India or anything like that. Okay, there was a common character for Indian education, which means what? Every person who is attending a school in India is actually channeled in a particular direction, and that direction can be set for rising or awakening the Indian political consciousness. Okay, so this introduction of modern educational system in a centralized method was actually another positive factor that contributed to the rise of national movement. Okay, now the soul of the press and literature. So along with this education, we also had certain other kind of publications or other methods of communication, and this is the press and other literature works. Let me see if there are any questions. Okay, I can't find anything, so I'm continuing. If you have any queries, please put it in the YouTube live chat. Okay, I will get back to you. So, the soul of the press and literature. So, the chief instrument through which nationalist-minded Indians spread the message of patriotism and modern economic, social, and political ideas and created an all-India consciousness was the press. Vernacular press, to be more, specific. The Indian press were both in English language as well and in vernacular languages as well. The English language had its own barriers, as I have just mentioned. Vernacular press played a huge role in political awakening of India. Huge role. This is also the reason why people like Governor General, Lord Lytton actually brought in the Vernacular Press Act. Why? Because this press was actually causing trouble for Britain. This was actually educating even the rural illiterate Indians on nationalist ideas. Okay, so the role of vernacular press in the Indian national movement is uncomparable. Official policies were constantly criticized. Indian point of view was put forward. People were asked to unite and work for national welfare. Ideas of self-government, democracy, industrialization, etc. were popularized. See, everything that all these Western political thoughts or ideas that the Indian intelligentsia learned from their education was put forth through press, through this mass media into the wide sections of Indian society. So Indian point of view was put forth. The government policies were criticized heavily through press. So how does this affect the national movement? When you just think about it, okay, when you read your newspaper every day morning, this newspaper will give you reports and opinions, etc., about certain things. It will be criticizing certain government policies. It will be forwarding some government policies. Okay, so you can read that particular report in the newspaper, and then you can have an opinion of yourself. You can chat with your friends. They will have a different opinion. Okay, so these kinds of communications will happen. The people will become more and more politically literate. They will know what is happening in the country, and this will give a very political consciousness to the people of India. This is how Indian press influenced the Indian masses. Okay, some examples are given here. Hindu Patriot, Amrit Basar Patrika, Indian Mirror, Bengali, Som Prakash, etc. I have given plenty of names that is given in your NCERT text. Please go through them. At the same time, use your Spectrum textbook in order to find the authors or the editors of these journals and newspapers and study their names as well. Okay, so take a particular newspaper and see who is the editor. That is very important. You may be asked match the following or something like that in the UPSC prelims. Okay, it is given in your Spectrum book. Towards the end there is an appendix where it is given as a list, so you can study it from that. Okay, so similarly various other forms of media or communication also were contemporary along with the press. They include literature, poems, stories, Okay, and dramas, etc., etc. For some example, Banking Chandra Chatterjee, who wrote Anandamath. Similarly, Rabindranath Tagore. Okay, these two are these two actually wrote in Bengali language. Similarly, Lakshminath Besubara in Assami, Vishnu Shastri Shiplekar in Marathi, Subramanya Bharati in Tamil, Bharatendu Harishchandra in Hindi, Altaf Khan Hussain in Urdu, etc., etc. These are also important. The author and the language in which he or she writes. Okay, I mean in the prelims there can be particular statement which says Rabindranath Tagore wrote a particular work in say Hindi. It's not Hindi. Usually Rabindranath Tagore wrote in Bengali. So the language is also very important. Please do look into that. Also given in the Spectrum textbook. Now, another popular concept that is associated with the Indian national movement is the rediscovery of India's past. Okay, what is this rediscovery of India's past? This was a very curious factor that affected the Indian national movement in two ways. There is a positive side for this as well as a negative side. So, by rediscovering India's past, various people meant various things. Okay, so many British officials and writers of this time constantly advanced the thesis that Indians had never been able to rule themselves in the past. Okay, so the Britishers or the British writers or literaturists or officials, they always put forth this idea of white man's superiority. Okay, Indians are not destined to rule themselves. It is the Europeans or the white people who are supposed to rule these uncivilized barbarians. That is the Indians, okay, according to them. Clear? This is the white man's rule of superiority over the Asians or the East Asians. Okay, so the nationalist leaders tried to erode the self-confidence and self-respect of the people by countering this propaganda. So when Britishers put forth that Europeans are destined to rule these people or they ruled Indians, the Indian intelligentsia actually countered this by saying, no, we are destined to rule ourselves. We can look into our own past, take inspiration from our own past. In our past we had great rulers, great civilizations, and where we had successfully ruled ourselves. Okay, and so we should take inspiration from all that and continue ourselves. We should not bow down to a foreign ruler. Okay, this was the counter propaganda initiated by Indian intelligentsia. So they pointed to the cultural heritage of India with pride and referred the critics to the political achievements of rulers like Ashoka, Chandragupta Vikramaditya, Akbar, etc., etc. Okay, so we are looking into India's past, and Ashoka, Chandragupta Maurya, etc., Chandragupta Vikramaditya are all very great rulers. We study about Akbar, his revenue policy and all these were extremely great. We studied with inspiration. Okay, so they began to rely a lot on history. We have to look into India's past and earn a sense of pride from it, and use that to counter the propaganda of British. This was the idea. Unfortunately, some nationalists went to the other extreme and began to glorify India's past uncritically, ignoring its weakness and backwardness. This is terrible. Okay, yes, we can take pride from our past. We can glorify our past as much as we want. That's fine. But we should still critically analyze each and every aspect of it. Just because it is Indian rule or Indians ruling Indians itself in the past doesn't mean that it was perfect. There was plenty of areas of weakness in that rule. There was strength also, but there were plenty of areas of weaknesses also. For example, even if we consider the time of Ashoka or Chandragupta Vikramaditya or something like that, even at that times there were certain social rigidities in existence. The Varna system, for example, the Shudras were the lowest sections of the society, and during the time of certain other rulers, there were untouchability very prevalent in India at that time. Okay, so we can go to history for taking pride, but we should look at it in a critical fashion. We should criticize these kinds of social segregation. We should criticize these kinds of caste and religious hierarchies, etc., etc. Blindly accepting what is in the past is a blunder. Okay, but unfortunately, some of the Indian nationalists turned a blind eye towards criticizing these weaknesses. Great harm was done, in particular, by the tendency to look only to the heritage of ancient India while ignoring the equally great achievements of medieval period. This was another blunder. Okay, most of the historians at that time, so most of the nationalist leaders who banged on history for getting that inspiration, they always looked into the ancient history, the times of Ashoka, Harshavardhana, etc. etc. What is the problem? They completely ignored medieval India. So what is the difference between, what is the major difference or the glaring difference between ancient India and medieval India? In ancient India, most rulers were Hindus, and in medieval India, it was the Islamic rulers, the Delhi Sultanate and Mughals. So that is the problem. So in the 19th century, when you actually start praising ancient India as the best, glorified times of India, and consider the medieval India as a very stagnated and backward times, obviously it had some kind of religious annotations. Okay, certain people began to look at it in a communal method. Okay, so they began to say that these nationalists are actually praising Hinduism and is actually criticizing Islam. So Hindu-Muslim divide started to happen in this national movement, or at least this actually contributed to some extent to that kind of division. And Britishers happily, encouraged this kind of division when their policy is divide and rule. Okay, so they actually encouraged this kind of Hindu-Muslim communal elements, and this did not do any good for Indian national movement. So a false sense of pride and smugness was produced, which tended to prevent Indians from looking critically at their own society. Clear? So going back to the past or rediscovering India's past should not mean completely or blindly accepting everything in the past. You can take inspiration from the past, but you have to critically analyze it with reason, with modern rationality, with modern thoughts, philosophies, etc. etc. Clear? So that is another factor. Now, racial arrogance of the rulers. Alright, any questions? Okay, I can't see any questions. If you have any questions, please put it in the live chat. Okay, so racial arrogance of the rulers. Already mentioned this in the previous section a bit. Most importantly, an important though secondary factor in the growth of national sentiments in India was the racial superiority adopted by Englishmen. Okay, in every field. Britishers, in the ruling sense, I already explained, Britishers considered themselves as superior to Indians, and they considered Europeans are destined to rule while Indians are uncivilized and barbaric in nature. Okay, but in other areas also, for example, in the areas of judiciary, if an Englishman is involved in a particular case, so for example a hit and run, then the punishment given to the Englishman is very mere, or comparatively it's basically nothing compared to the punishment given to an Indian. Okay, so Europeans and Indians were treated completely differently, and there was huge partiality in treatment between these two sections. So all in all, they considered their race, the Europeans considered their race superior to that of Indians. So that is the racial arrogance that was practiced throughout the British rule. Best example, Mahatma Gandhi, when during his train travel, you have heard of this story, right? While Mahatma Gandhi was traveling to St. Maritzburg railway station, he was in the first class. He took a ticket for the first class in the train, and he was actually pulled out of the train because a black man, a non-white person is not supposed to travel in first class. This is the racial arrogance that the Europeans practiced, not just in India but in every colony that they ever had. Okay, only these white people were accepted in European clubs. They were not permitted to travel in the same compartment. I mean, Indians or non-white people were not allowed to travel in first class in trains and all. Okay, so this was kind of a humiliation to the people in the colonies, the white man's racial arrogance. This was another factor, although secondary, which contributed to the rise of national consciousness. So these factors were brimming for a long time. All these factors that I have explained so far has been happening for a very long time. But there are certain other very important factors that immediately created this national movement. Okay, whenever we study about something, for example, say 1857 revolt, we looked into various factors, but there were always some immediate causes, okay, that contributed to the revolt. Similarly, here, as far as India's national movement is concerned, there are certain factors which contributed to that rise or that political awakening in the immediate past. What are these factors? By 1870s, it was evident that Indian nationalism had gathered enough strength and momentum to appear as a major force in Indian political history. That's true. Because of all these things, because of the education, Indian work of Indian intelligentsia, reformers, the plight of peasants, workers, artisans, all these things, the national movement was imminent. Okay, it will happen anyway. It was gathering strength. It was gathering more and more mass base, but still it was not present in its entirety. Okay, it was not outwardly visible as of yet. There was no body or there was no national movement as such happening at this time, although all these factors were still present and is brimming on in the sidelines. So the most important factor in the immediate sense were the reactionary policies of Lord Lytton. Lord Lytton is one of the most reactionary governor generals who ever came to India. Okay, some of his policies, for example, say the second war against Afghanistan aroused vehement agitation against the heavy cost of this war. Okay, the second Afghan war was fought during his time. Problem was the war was fought for British interests, but the cost of the war was borne by Indians. Okay, so the economically the Indians had to bear the cost of all this war, while it is actually giving nothing to Indians. It is just furthering the interests of British. So Indians vehemently criticized this policy. Arms Act of 1878. Okay, according to this Arms Act, Indians were not allowed to carry weapons. So Europeans are allowed and Indians are not allowed. So Indians thought this as a threat, this as a danger. Okay, so for once the Britishers are not trusting Indians, so that is why they are taking away the arms. For two, they are not doing that to Europeans. Okay, so Indians felt a sense of danger. Similarly, the import duties on British textiles were removed. Okay, so the Indian textiles when went to Europe were imposed with heavy duties, heavy tariffs. So the Indian exports were not doing well. At the same time, British exports to India or the imports which came to India were actually given free entry into the Indian territory without any kind of tariff, and this actually began to ruin Indian industries. So obviously it affected the Indian economy and consequently it affected the larger sections of Indian society. Vernacular Press Act 1878. Please do study about this act in detail. The clauses of this act is given in Spectrum textbook. You can study that. This Vernacular Press Act was another huge reactionary policy by Lord Lytton, according to which all the vernacular newspapers or publications in India were imposed with severe regulations. Vernacular newspapers, very important. It is not applicable to English press. Okay, only vernacular newspapers. For example, to avoid this act, to avoid getting into the ambit of this act, Amrit Basar Patrika, a very famous Indian newspaper, overnight turned into an English daily. Okay, it was actually a vernacular newspaper, but in order to avoid the clutches of this act, Amrit Basar Patrika overnight turned into an English publication. So this Vernacular Press Act was vehemently criticized because it was imposing huge restrictions on freedom of press. Imperial Durbar at Delhi in 1877. This was another disastrous policy disastrous event that happened in Lytton's time. Why is this conducting an Imperial Durbar such bad faith? Why? Because at the same time, certain regions in India, especially Bengal, was undergoing famine, severe famine. So in certain areas of India, people are dying due to the lack of food and basic amenities. And here in Delhi, an Imperial Durbar, a luxurious Durbar, has been thrown by Lord Lytton. So this also angered Indians. instead of diverting this money for the safeguarding of the people who are starving, he is actually living a luxurious life. Okay, similarly, reducing the maximum age limit of sitting for Indian civil service exam from 21 to 19. Okay, right now it is 32, but those times it was actually 21. What did Lytton do? Lytton tried to reduce it further down to 19. Why is this dangerous? Because already Indians are finding it very difficult to pass this exam, and reducing the age limit from 21 to 19 literally makes it impossible for Indians to get through. Okay, because this exam is pretty tough. It's the medium of examination is English. You need to study Latin and certain other languages as well. Okay, and all this, only very few number of Indians were passing this exam already, and further limiting this age means what? Britishers are trying their best to completely weed out Indians from administration, civil service. Okay, so all these policies were heavily criticized by Indians and were the immediate causes for the rise of national movement. There was one other important event that happened around this time, and that is known as the Ilbert Bill controversy. So what is this Ilbert Bill controversy? After Lytton, Ripon came to India. Okay, Lord Ripon was a comparatively sympathizer to India, comparatively less reactionary. I mean, Lytton was extremely reactionary. Ripon was comparatively lenient towards Indians. So in 1883, Ripon came up with this idea of an Ilbert Bill. Okay, Ilbert was a law member at this time, and this bill is named after him, Ilbert Bill. According to this bill, it enabled Indian district magistrates and sessions judges to try Europeans in criminal cases. Okay, until now, Europeans could only be tried by European judges. Indian judges had no power over Europeans as far as criminal cases were concerned. But this bill actually was intended to give power to Indian district magistrates and sessions judges to try even Europeans for criminal cases. So this is positive step. Okay, this is a positive step as far as Indians are concerned. But when this bill was introduced, there were heavy protests from the side of Europeans. Europeans protested that Indians are inferior to them and they cannot be the judge of any Europeans in any matter. Okay, and they organized a huge protest and all, and finally government of India could not do anything but to withdraw this bill. Government of India bowed down to the popular pressure of Europeans and they took out the bill. So Indians began to became very angry. Why? Because when the Europeans protested, the government bowed down to them and they withdrew this bill. What does this mean? This means that Indians will never get justice. Europeans can only be tried by Europeans. They cannot be tried by Indians, which means what? British is still continuing the policy of racial arrogance, racial superiority. Okay, similarly, they are even in the area of criminal justice, they are actually dividing the people as Europeans and Indians. So this actually was a huge insult for the Indians, and this also led to the rise of political consciousness and awakening in majority of India. Okay, so all these factors contributed to the rise of national movement. Clear? Okay, so I'm continuing. Predecessors of the Indian national movement, National Congress. So while all these things are happening, certain other interesting things are also happening. Okay, even before the Indian National Congress was born. Indian National Congress was born only in 1885. This is the first all India agency that came as into a national character. But that does not mean there were no other organizations there which fought for same purposes. Okay, so the Indian National Congress was the first organized expression of Indian national movement on an all India scale. That is true. And it came into being only in 1885. But before that, there were certain other organizations or reformers, etc. etc. Okay, so we will very briefly look into them also. For instance, Raja Ram Mohan Roy. He was the first, father of Indian Renaissance. Okay, he was a social reformer. He was a prominent personality among the Indian intelligentsia who brought in various reforms in Indian society. You know about him, I am not going into detail. So that is one person. Earliest public association in modern India was probably the Landholders Society. Okay, this came into being as an association of the landlords of Bengal, Bihar and Orissa in the year 1837 with the purpose of promoting the class interests of the landlords. Okay, so the pre-Congress organizations, the predecessors of Indian National Congress, had, they were not national in character, and they also did not had a national aspiration. They also never had a an all India kind of appeal. Why? Because they had their own vested interests. These landholder society were catering to the needs of this class of people, that is the landlords. 1843 was organized the Bengal British Indian Society to promote general public interests. Okay, these two organizations merged in 1851 to form British India Association. Okay, another organization called Bengal British Indian Society came into being in 1843 to promote general public awareness, in the field of politics. And later in 1851, these two societies, that is the Landholder Society and Bengal British Indian Society, these both were merged together into British Indian Association. These are all prelims questions, so study it in that way. Okay. Now, another important organization is the Madras Native Association and the Bombay Association, both established in 1852. Similarly, Scientific Society founded by Syed Ahmad Khan. Another, and not that much prominent, but still very important organization as far as Indian history is concerned. Okay, one common thing to all these organizations, all these predecessors of Indian National Congress, is the fact that they were dominated by wealthy aristocratic elements and were provincial or local in character. Okay, they were dominated by wealthy aristocratic elements, which means the upper classes of Indian society. There were no representations of the majority of Indians. Peasants, artisans, laborers, no one had any say in any of these organizations. All of them were run by upper classes, aristocrats. And their goals were also very local and provincial in character. They never intended for freedom, or they never intended to rise national political consciousness or anything. They had their vested interests. Okay, so these two are very common to all the pre-Congress organizations. Even when the Congress is born, during the initial stages, International Congress is also very much an upper class organization, but eventually it will start to get a wider base. Now, another important organization that came up in 1866, founded by Dadabhai Naoroji, the grand old man of India, is the East India Association, which was formed in London. Very important. In the prelims, the statement might come like, Dadabhai Naoroji founded East India Association in Bombay. Immediately, when you see Dadabhai Naoroji and East India Association, you will say that statement is true. Be very careful. It is founded in London, not in Bombay. Okay, so what was the aim of this organization? This organization was founded to discuss the Indian question and to influence British public men to promote Indian welfare. So, some sections of Indian intelligentsia actually thought that Britishers want the people of Britain, the British citizens, they wanted what is good for India, but they don't know what is the conditions that are prevailing in India. Okay, this is one thought process that happened around that time. So it was thought that if the British public came to know the realities in India, they will help in promoting Indian interests. So East India Association was one such agency which was put forth to influence the British public and to educate the British public on what is happening in India. Okay, similarly, Justice Ranade and others organized the Pune Sarvajanik Sabha in 1870. Madras Mahajan Sabha started in 1881 and the Bombay Presidency Association 1885. Okay, these organizations mainly devoted to criticism of important administrative and legislative measures. I'm just reading through them. These, just study the names, and you do not have to study the exact year, but try to have an idea or so that you can arrange them chronologically. Okay, the order in which all these are formed. Okay, sorry. Then another one is led by Surendranath Banerjee and Ananda Mohan Bose. Okay, the younger nationalists of Bengal, along with these two, founded the Indian Association in July 1876. Okay, in July 1876, the Indian Association was formed by Surendranath Banerjee and Ananda Mohan Bose. Okay, it was a very interesting organization in the sense that it tried to build a master base to accommodate poor sections of Indian society. It actually lowered the membership fees for poor classes. It took the first major issue that this particular association took up for agitation was the reform of Indian civil service. Okay, that was the first reform that it took up, or the first major issue that it took up for reform. That is reform of civil service. Then the Indian Association also carried out agitation against Arms Act, Vernacular Press Act, etc., etc. They also fought for the tenants against the oppression of zamindars. Okay, they organized popular demonstrations of thousands of peasants against the rent bill to get the rent bill changed in the favor of tenants. So all in all, this Indian Association is a very prominent pre-Congress organization that worked in various fields. Okay, so now the time is very ripe for the formation of an all India political organization. Okay, we have plenty of other organizations doing plenty of other things. People are becoming politically conscious. Educated Indians or the Indian intelligentsia is inculcating education into the Indian masses. Okay, various journals, press release, etc., etc. are doing their jobs. So finally, now it is the time for having an all India kind of organization that can take the movement into the next level, into a national movement. This is the time when Indian National Congress comes to the picture. Okay, the Indian Association around this time sponsored an all India national conference at Calcutta in December 1883. Sorry. Okay, this congress or this conference was attended by several leaders from outside of Bengal. It adopted a program very similar to the one adopted by Indian National Congress, with which it merged in 1886. So, the Indian Association that is formed in Bengal by Surendranath Banerjee and Ananda Mohan Bose, this organization was very prominent in the sense, to an extent, it took up almost every activities very much similar to how INC worked later. This Indian Association actually merged with Indian National Congress in 1886. Okay, 1885 Indian National Congress is formed. The very next year, this one, the Indian Association which is formed in Bengal, merges with Indian National Congress. Okay, so now let's look at Indian National Congress. I will stop after the end of this class, end of this particular chapter. Okay, I thought I can take 2 chapters today, but I am still recovering. I had, I was COVID positive, and just yesterday I became negative. Okay, so I am still having certain issues. So after this particular chapter, I will stop for today. The next chapter I will take tomorrow. Okay, so only a few more slides. Indian National Congress. Okay, so an all India organization finally came into being in 1885. That is the INC. Okay, this organization was a matter of there were plenty of Indians who were trying to build such an organization. We already saw plenty of organizations came up, but none of them had a national character. Okay, nobody could actually achieve that national character for any organizations that they came up with. But finally, it was a European named as Alan Octavian Hume, A.O. Hume, a retired English civil servant. He is the person who finally brought forth this all India level organization called the Indian National Congress. The first session of which was attended by 72 delegates and was held at Bombay in December 1885. And the first session of Indian National Congress was presided over by W.C. Banerjee, Umesh Chandra Banerjee. Okay, all these are prelims questions. Please be careful. Umesh Chandra Banerjee WC Banerjee is the first president of Indian National Congress. And the first session was held at Bombay. Okay, second session was actually held at Calcutta. That is when it merges with the Indian Association. Okay, so the aims of Indian National Congress were declared to be promotion of friendly relationship between nationalist political workers from different parts of the country, development and consolidation of the feelings of national unity irrespective of all kinds of discriminations. Similarly, formulation of popular demands and their presentation before the government. Most important of all, training and organization of public opinion in the country. So these were the initial goals of INC. Which were they? Promotion of friendly relationship between nationalist political workers from different parts of the country. So trying to integrate India into one unified nation politically. Then development and consolidation of feelings of national unity irrespective of all differences. People understood that Britishers are playing the game of divide and rule. So we should not divide, we should stay united. We should not promote any elements that is trying to divide our country. We should stand united against all that. That was the second thing. Then third, formulation of popular demands and their presentation before the government. Identify what the Indians needed and present it before the government. Okay, they thought that government do not know what the Indians really want. So if they present, if they identify what the aspirations of Indian people are and then present it before the government will actually implement it. The government will be happy to implement it. That is what the Indian earlier leaders of INC thought, although it was a blunder. Okay. Similarly, training and organization of public opinion in the country, educating the people politically. Okay, so these were the initial sets of goals. So some historians call this a safety valve organization. Okay, they thought that Indian National Congress was an organization which was supposed to act as a safety valve to release the pressure that was brimming against the British. Okay, Britishers were implementing policies that were vehemently criticized by huge sections of Indian society. So, if an organization is formed which is represented by Indians and which can act as an intermediary between the British government and the Indian masses, then this organization could possibly act as a safety valve which can release the pressure and which can bring down the discontent brimming in the Indian masses. Okay, but this is not a very popular theory. Okay, safety valve theory has been criticized also. Plenty of historians say that it is not a INC was never a safety valve. It may have acted as a safety valve in certain sense, but it had very pure intentions. Alan Octavian Hume himself was a sympathizer of Indians. He wholeheartedly wanted development of India. Okay, so that is also another kind of view in this regard. So safety valve theory, although we study about it, understand that it may not possibly be true. There are both sides for the argument. Okay, so more than anything else, the National Congress represented the urge of politically conscious Indians to set up a national organization to work for political and economic advancement. Okay, Surendranath Banerjee and many other leaders of Bengal did not attend the first session of INC. Okay, first session of INC happened 1885 December, Bombay. There were only 72 delegates. These people, Surendranath Banerjee, etc., did not attend the first session. These are prominent leaders, okay, very prominent leaders, very influential in their own regions. So their absence is not something that can be looked at, that is positive. Okay, so during the second session, as I have already mentioned, second session happened in Calcutta. So in this session, SN Banerjee and all attended, and they actually merged the Indian Association with Indian National Congress. Okay, so that is already I have explained this in the previous slide. So from this session, we see that Indian National Congress starts to become a larger and more popular organization. The number of delegates was during the first session it was only 72. After this session, it crossed about 400 plus delegates were there, and very soon it began to have thousands of delegates. Okay, so very quickly INC starts to grow into an all India organizations having representation from every nook and corner of India. Okay, so this session, the December 1886 session, the second session of INC was actually chaired by none other than Dadabhai Naoroji. This is also very important. The important study about the important sessions of International Congress, study who presided over that session, where that session happened, and what was the important decision that was taken in that session. You don't have to study every session of INC. There are certain important ones. Just look into that. Again, the list is given in the Spectrum textbook towards the end as an annexure. Okay, so women representation was also given in INC. In 1890, Kadambini Ganguly, the first woman graduate of Calcutta University, addressed this Congress session. Later, we see Sarojini Naidu, Annie Besant, etc. also coming into the picture. Okay, so this women participation was symbolic of the fact that India's struggle for freedom would raise Indian women from degraded positions. Okay, once India struggles for freedom and finally attains freedom, Indian women will also have the benefits of all this. When women are also brought into the political activity, they too will have this political consciousness and they will understand that they are not supposed to be living in houses under the in a patriarchal society. They also have the same rights and equality as men and they should also come forward. So participation of women in the Indian national movement actually emancipated Indian women and brought them into an equal status with that of the men. Okay, now apart from these conferences, political provincial conferences were organized, provincial and local associations were held, and nationalist newspapers were the other prominent organs of the growing national movement. Okay, other than International Congress, plenty of other organizations were also there, plenty of publications were there, journals, dramas, ideas were given, flowing through various media to the majority of Indians, to the Indian masses. But remember that even now, Indian national movement do not have a mass base. After all this, even now, the masses are still far away from Indian national movement. We see that they come into the picture only when Mahatma Gandhi arrives at the scene. Okay, so what are the reforms that were put forth by INC, Indian National Congress? The earlier nationalists actually, they wanted a larger share in the government of their own country and made an appeal to the principle of democracy. But they did not ask for the immediate fulfillment of this goal. Their immediate demands were extremely moderate. And for this reason, they were known as moderates. Okay, they never asked for independence or they never asked for self-rule. They asked for, wider representation in legislative council, Indianization of civil services and all these things. Okay, so their demands were very much moderate and that is why their methods were also moderate. Okay, prayer, petition and protest. This was their method. Okay, so due to this kind of activity, they are known as moderates. The British government was forced by their agitation to pass the Indian Councils Act of 1892. By this act, the number of members of Imperial Legislative Council as well as the provincial councils were increased. Okay, some of the historians say that the moderates achieved nothing in the sense that their activities were very much passive. Okay, but that is not true. Yes, it is true that the majority of Indians never, the Indian masses never came into the picture at this time. But still, moderates gave a platform for the Indian national movement to develop. Okay, the base of it was actually set by these moderates. Although their demands were very much less than what should have been asked. Some of these members could be elected indirectly by the Indians, but the official majority was retained. The councils were also given the right to discuss annual budgets, but they could not vote on them. Okay, these are the features of the Act of 1892. This is given in your Spectrum textbook or in your NCERTs. You can even read this in I think Lakshmikant textbook also. Okay, go through that. Do look into the individual points. What are the changes that were brought by this act. Okay, but the thing is, The nationalists were totally dissatisfied by this act. See, you can look at this particular point. You can discuss the budget, but you can't vote on them. Then what is the point in it? You can simply discuss and write down notes or give advices maybe. But if it is not going to be looked upon, or if it is not going to be implemented, or if you have no voting power, then it is pointless, na? So Britishers are essentially mocking Indians through this act. So none of the Indians liked this act, and they considered or they declared this act as a hoax. Okay, and then the Indians understood that they have to pick it up. They have to start protesting it to the next level. And then, for this purpose, they borrowed a very interesting slogan of the American Revolution. That is, no taxation without representation. The no taxation without representation was actually the slogan of American Revolution. Okay, if you want to tax us, if you want us to pay the taxes, then we should be represented in the government. Okay, if we do not get representation, then we are not paying taxes. No taxation without representation. Okay, so the moderates also brought out this particular slogan in their protest against British policies. From the beginning of 20th century, put forward the claim of Swarajya. Okay, after the early phase of Indian national movement, around the beginning of 20th century, things starts to shift to us in a different direction. The moderates start to lose their prominence in government or in the Indian National Congress, and another section of the Congress starts to become very dominant. They are known as extremists. We will learn about extremists tomorrow, okay? In coming chapters, we will look into that. But once the extremists come into picture, the kind of demands put forth to the British also changes. For example, look at this. The claim for Swarajya or self-government within the British Empire on the model of self-governing colonies of Australia and Canada was demanded in 1905. Okay, this was actually Gopal Krishna Gokhale was the president of INC in 1905, and later in 1906 it was Dadabhai Naoroji. Both these people were moderates. Okay, both these people, Gokhale and Naoroji, were moderates. But even then, Congress had a huge number of extremists by this time, and due to this pressure, the kind of demand also changed. Until now, it was very mere demands put forth by the moderate leaders. But look at these demands. Swarajya. This is not Purna Swaraj. Don't confuse it. Purna Swaraj is put forth by Congress only in 1929 Lahore session, presided by Jawaharlal Nehru. But the idea of Swaraj or self-rule within British Empire, like in Australia or Canada, was actually put forth as early as 1905 and 1906 by the INC. Understand the difference? Don't confuse it. Very common mistake. Okay, now economic reforms. So growing poverty and economic backwardness, failure of modern industry, failure of agriculture to grow, all these were blamed upon British. It was British revenue policies, British economic policies that ruined or drained India, no doubt. So economic backwardness of India was blamed upon Britain. And the chief remedy that was suggested for removal of Indian poverty was the rapid development of modern industries in India. While industrialization happened in Britain and other European nations, India was actually de-industrialized. I told you this. Okay, it was not just stagnated, it was actually de-industrialized. The reverse happened in India. Indian industries collapsed and its place was taken by nothing. Okay, so industrializing India was the only way out of this poverty. This was proposed to the British. They popularized the Indian leaders, Indian national movement leaders, popularized the idea of Swadeshi and boycott. Okay, so if you want to improve the Indian industries, then Indian goods has to be promoted. That is Swadeshi. And you have to boycott British goods or foreign goods. So the idea of Swadeshi and boycott came in as early as 1890s. We study about this Swadeshi movement only in 1905 after the partition of Bengal. Okay, so that movement was named as Swadeshi movement. But The idea of Swadeshi and boycott existed even before that. Even in the 1890s, we see this particular idea being implemented, promoting Indian goods and boycotting foreign goods. There were persistent agitation for the reduction of land revenue because it was putting too much burden on the peasants, and peasants had to approach moneylenders who were actually oppressing them. Okay, all these problems were occurring because of inhuman revenue demands, and this was again agitated upon. So they declared high taxation to be one of the causes of India's poverty and demanded abolition of the salt tax and reduction of land revenue. Okay, INC did this. INC came out with these kinds of demands for the Indian peasants. They condemned the high military expenditure on government of India. This was another area where too much money was used for vested British interests. Britishers were waging wars using Indian money, and not for the benefit of Indians, but for vested interests of Britain. Okay, and these heavy expenses had to be borne by Indians who are already suffering a lot. So this was also criticized. So these kinds of economic reforms were put forth by INC. Now, administrative and other reforms. Okay, no questions so far. Alright, administrative and other reforms. The most important administrative reform the Indians desired at this time was Indianization of the higher grades of administrative service. This is a very moderate thing. Okay, this is the biggest demands that they put forth in the field of administration. They should have demanded for, say, representation of Indians in government at a very high level. But rather than that, they wanted Indianization of Indian, higher grades of administrative services. Similarly, economically, the European monopoly over higher services was harmful in two grounds. Number one, Europeans were paid very high rates, and this made Indian administration very costly. And Indians of similar qualifications could be employed on lower salaries. This is one thing. Europeans and Indians, both civil servants, both of equal rankings maybe. European is given a huge salary and Indian is given a mere salary. Discrimination. Number two, the Europeans actually send a huge portion of this salary back to their country, Britain. Okay, so this wealth or this huge salary that they were gaining is being sent outside India. Their pensions, that too was going to Britain. So all this added to the drain that was already happening economically in India. Remember, the colonial civil service at those times were one of the highest paid jobs in the world. Okay, so huge amount were paid as salaries to these people from Indian exchequer, and this salary has been taken back to Britain, which means again draining in one direction. A unidirectional drain is happening. Politically, the nationalists hoped that the Indianization of these services would make the administration more responsive to Indian needs. So they thought, Indian National Congress thought that if Indians can be put forth into these administrative posts more and more, then finally the government will have an Indian character, okay, and will be more suited for Indian needs. This was the thought process. Okay, so the nationalists demanded separation of judiciary from executive. Okay, this is another very common demand. They laid a great deal of emphasis on spread of primary education among the masses. Okay, they also repudiated downward filtration theory. They wanted primary education, mass education. Okay, literacy rate in India was very high at that time. Okay, only very handful of Indians were properly educated. Majority of Indians, as high as 90%, were illiterates. Clear? So they wanted mass education. They urged the development of agricultural banks to save the peasants from the clutches of moneylenders. We already looked into how moneylenders has been oppressing these peasants. Okay, I explained that during the previous lesson, so I'm not going into detail at this point of time. Demanded extension of medical and health facilities, improvement of police system to make it honest, efficient and popular. So in general, public utility systems had to be encouraged. Okay, all these were the basic demands. Similarly, defense of civil rights, value of the freedoms of speech and the press. Okay, in 1897, Bombay government arrested Bal Gangadhar Tilak and several other leaders and tried them for spreading disaffection against the government through speeches and writings. Okay, in one of my previous classes, I told you that very recently during the Corona times, okay, even now during the Corona times, we hear about this Epidemic Diseases Act, right? This Epidemic Diseases Act was actually brought forth by Britain. It is a colonial era act that came in 1890s. And Bal Gangadhar Tilak was the first person who was arrested based on this act and was thrown into prison. Why? Because in his newspaper publications, the Maratha and Kesari, Bal Gangadhar Tilak severely criticized the British method of handling plague. Okay, during the 1890s, bubonic plague disease was happening in Bombay, in the Bombay presidency, and Bal Gangadhar Tilak heavily criticized the British methods of handling this epidemic through his publications, Maratha and Kesari. And Britishers did not like this, so they charged Bal Gangadhar Tilak with Epidemic Diseases Act and threw him into prison. Okay, that is a current affair related history, so keep that in mind while going for UPSC exam. Similarly, the Natu brothers were deported without trial for their activities. Tilak's arrest in fact galvanized the country and marked the beginning of a new phase of national movement. So Bal Gangadhar Tilak was a very prominent leader at this time, but his activities were still very much confined in Maratha region in the Bombay presidency. But arresting that kind of a leader, that kind of a personality, actually galvanized the entire country and marked the beginning of a new phase of national movement. So that was the kind of influence people like Tilak had around that time. Okay, so methods of political work. Indian national movement up to 1905 was dominated by leaders who have often been described as moderate nationalists or moderates. You know that. Constitutional agitation within the four walls of the law. Slow, orderly political progress. This was their method. Okay, they did not support mass protests or picketing or any of these things. Instead, they went for slow prayer petition kind of thing. Constitutional means. Okay, it had a two-pronged direction. To build up strong public opinion in India, that is number one, and to provide the British government to introduce reforms along the directions laid down by nationalists. This is two. This was the idea. Increase the political awareness of Indians, increase the public opinion, and persuade the British to make reforms according to the directions given or laid down by the nationalists. This was the two-pronged strategy of INC, or the moderate factions of INC. Moderate nationalists also worked to educate British public opinion. In 1889, a British Committee on Indian National Congress was founded. In 1890, this committee started a journal called India. Okay, because as I have explained earlier, they believed that if the British actually knew what the Indians wanted, then they would actually be favorable and will be helpful in that manner. Okay, so Indians thought that if they make the Britishers aware about the true realities of India, then the Britishers would take proactive steps to remedy various issues. This was the thought process, although it was never the case. Okay, so they therefore planned not to expel the British, but to transform British rule to approximate to national rule. Okay, and later when they took note of the evils of British rule and the failure of the government to accept nationalist demand for reform, many of them stopped talking of loyalty to British rule and started demanding self-government for India. Clear? So initially they had no intention of throwing out British and replacing it with an Indian administration, but rather they wanted to transform the British rule to adapt to the Indian methods, to the Indian needs. Okay, this is a very prominent feature of moderate phase. Moderates never wanted to replace British rule with Indian leaders, but rather they wanted the British rule to be transformed into something that is suited for the needs of Indians. But later on they understand that that is not going to work, and the national movement itself will see a phase shift. Okay, so what was the attitude of the government? Indian National Congress has been established. They has been putting forth these kinds of demands. People are all, they are, getting more and more supporters every day. So what is the government doing? How did the government react to this? The British authorities were from the beginning hostile to the rising nationalist movement and had become suspicious of National Congress. They did not like this idea at all. Initially they did okay. At the beginning there was no hostility, or I mean there was hostility, but it was not openly expressed. Okay, maybe because of Hume's leadership. Alan Octavian Hume, the founder of INC, is actually European. So maybe Britishers, due to a European leadership of Congress, or European being the founder of Congress, then initially the British did not openly show its hostility towards INC. Okay, they even called invited the delegates to a National Congress to a garden party in 1886. So initially the Viceroy was very much, not openly showing this hostility. He even invited the Congress leaders for a garden party. But eventually, Britishers started to openly be hostile towards INC. They started to brand the nationalist leaders as disloyal babus, seditious Brahmins, violent villains, etc. etc. Why? Why seditious Brahmins and disloyal babus? Because even now, Indian National Congress at the early phases, it was led by upper classes, upper sections of the society. Lower sections had no representation around this time. Later on it will happen, but now during the early phase, it is still a very upper class organization. Okay, so they called all these bad names towards INC. Okay, so this is the last slide for today. I am stopping it after this one. Okay, so the evaluation of early national movement. So how can we evaluate the initial phase of INC or the initial stages of Indian national movement? According to some critics, the national movement and the INC did not achieve much success in the early phase. Okay, it was not much successful in the early phase. Some of the critics at least says that. The national movement during these years had no roots among the masses. Very important. This is the reason why they say that it was not successful. Why? Because they did not had a mass base. It was essentially an upper class organization putting forth upper class aspirations and needs. Early national movement succeeded in creating a wide national awakening, in rousing among the people the feeling that they belong to one common nation, the Indian nation. Okay, despite these criticisms, it has to be noted that there are certain areas where the initial phases of nationalist movement succeeded. That is, most importantly, in raising that political consciousness in the people and making the people feel that they belong to one nation, that is India, rather than being a person of a particular princely state or anything. They are Indians. So that feeling of nationalism was actually cultivated during the early phase of national movement, and in Indian National Congress, or the moderate leaders of Indian National Congress, had a huge role in inculcating or cultivating that spirit among the Indians. It trained the people in the art of political work, popularized among them the ideas of democracy and nationalism, propagated among them the modern outlook, and exposed before them the evil results of British rule. Okay, so maybe they put forth moderate ideas and moderate demands and all, but still they were doing a lot of things. You can't say that it was complete failure. Okay, they were putting forth political consciousness. They were actually putting forth a modern outlook. They exposed the evils of British rule. So they actually set up a platform for the launch of international movement to the next level. This was the base. This is the foundation. Okay, so it made the people recognize the economic content and character of British imperialism. It evolved a common political and economic program around which the Indian people could gather and wage political struggle later on. Okay, so this is the essence or the crux of what the moderate factions of INC did. It evolved a common political and economic program around which Indian people could gather and wage political struggle. Clear? So this is the contribution of moderate leaders of INC. Okay, so this is a very brief evaluation of early national movement as far as your NCERT text is concerned. Okay, do supplement this with Spectrum textbook also for your prelims. Okay, so I will stop it here. Chapter 13, I will actually take it tomorrow, and some other chapters also we will see tomorrow. For today, I am stopping it at this point. Okay, so that is it. Thank you all for joining. Thanks to all of you for supporting. Please do subscribe to this channel if you have not already done that. I will share the PDFs of this slides in the Telegram channel. The link is given here, t.me/msrw1. Okay, also kindly share this with your friends, and so that they can also, learn from these classes, for their preparations and all. Okay, so that's it, everybody. Thank you for joining. See you again tomorrow. Until then, bye bye.